Story 1. When I was about 10 years old, my uncle, a boy the same age as me, found a horned toad together in the gravelly parking lot of our little church in Central Texas. It was the 1950s, a time when kids roamed freely, the skies felt bigger, and secrets were easier to keep. My uncle and I didn't think much of it when we scooped up the toad, marveling at its rough, spiny skin and small, sharp horns. It was a creature that felt ancient, like it belonged more to the wilderness than to the dusty lot behind the church. "This one's special," my uncle whispered. "Look at its eyes." Its dark, beady eyes seemed to follow me, and for a second, I felt a shiver in the blazing heat. But I shook it off. I wasn't scared of some little lizard, no matter how strange it looked. Without thinking, I slid the toad into my pants pocket. I could barely feel it then, just the faint weight of it against my thigh. "We'll take it home after church," I said. My uncle grinned and nodded. Inside, the sanctuary was cool and dim, a sharp contrast to the scorching sun outside. The wooden pews smelled of varnish, and the voices of the congregation rose in hymns that echoed off the high ceiling. My grandmother sat beside me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She always kept a close eye on me, as though waiting for the moment I would embarrass her. She was the kind of woman whose stern glances could straighten a child's spine faster than any scolding. The service began, and I tried to sit still, but I couldn't shake the thought of the toad in my pocket. Was it moving? No, I told myself. It was just sitting there, calm and still. But then I felt it, a faint, deliberate shift, a clawed foot scraping against the fabric. I tensed, my eyes darting toward my grandmother, who was focused on the preacher. "Be still," I whispered to myself, barely moving my lips. But the toad wasn't having it. It shifted again, and this time I felt the sharp jab of its tiny horns pressing into my leg. I sucked in a breath, trying not to yelp. Sweat began to bead on my forehead. The harder I pressed my leg against the pew, the more the toad seemed to dig in. "Stop fidgeting," my grandmother hissed under her breath, her voice sharp and low. Her piercing eyes bore into me, but I couldn't explain what was happening. The preacher droned on, his voice rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm, but I couldn't focus. The toad was moving more now, wriggling and twisting like it was fighting to escape. The horn stabbed at my skin, and I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek to keep from crying out. My heart was pounding, and I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples. Then out of nowhere, I felt something wet. My stomach dropped. I reached down subtly, pretending to adjust my pants, and felt a dampness spreading through the fabric. My hand came away sticky. "What's going on?" I whispered to myself. It didn't make sense. I hadn't crushed the toad, I was sure of that. But the wetness was real, and it smelled metallic, like blood. My breathing quickened, and I shifted uncomfortably, trying to figure out what to do. My grandmother's gaze snapped to me again. "Outside! Now!" she whispered sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded quickly, sliding out of the pew as quietly as I could. My legs felt shaky as I made my way to the back of the church, every step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't look at anyone, didn't dare meet the eyes of the congregation. I just kept walking, my hand pressed against my pocket, feeling the strange, warm wetness seeping through. Once outside, I stumbled into the blinding sunlight and ducked behind the church building, my breath coming in short gasps. I yanked the toad out of my pocket, half expecting it to be crushed or dead. But it wasn't. It was alive, very alive, and staring at me with those dark, unblinking eyes. Its horns were smeared with something red. Blood. My blood. But that wasn't what scared me the most. No. It was the way the toad was looking at me, its body heaving with each breath, its tiny chest rising and falling, like it was mocking me. And then it happened. The toad opened its mouth and hissed. It wasn't the kind of sound a toad should make. It was low and guttural, almost like a growl, and it sent chills racing down my spine. I stumbled back, dropping the creature onto the gravel. But instead of hopping away, it stayed there, staring at me. Its body began to shift, its limbs stretching and contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. "What the?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, rooted to the spot as the toad's shape twisted and changed. Its skin darkened, and its horns grew longer, sharper. Its eyes glowed faintly red, and its mouth curled into what I can only describe as a grin. A terrible, toothy grin. "Help me," I whimpered, but no one was around to hear. The toad, no, the thing, let out a noise that was somewhere between a laugh and a snarl. And then it lunged. I screamed, finally breaking free of my paralysis, and stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. I hit the ground hard, the gravel biting into my palms. The creature was on me in an instant, its claws raking against my leg, its teeth snapping just inches from my face. "Get off me!" I shouted, thrashing wildly. I grabbed a nearby rock and swung it with all my strength, striking the creature square in the head. It let out an unearthly screech and flew backward, landing in a heap a few feet away. I didn't wait to see if it would get back up. I scrambled to my feet and ran, my heart pounding like a drum. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the dirt road, leading away from the church. Only then did I dare to look back. The lot was empty. The toad, or whatever it had become, was gone. But my leg was still bleeding, the pain sharp and raw. I pressed my hand against the wound, my mind racing. What had I just seen? What had I brought into that church? When I finally made it back to my grandmother, I told her I had fallen and scraped my leg. She didn't ask questions, just cleaned the wound and gave me one of her disapproving looks. But I knew I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Story 2. I didn't want to go. That's how it started. When the church announced the weekend youth retreat at St. Mark's, a place half under renovation in Holy Eerie, I begged my parents to let me skip, but they wouldn't budge. "It'll be good for you," they said. "You'll make memories," they said. They had no idea what kind of memory it would become. St. Mark's was ancient, built in the early 1900s, and its renovations seemed to only emphasize its age. The church hallways smelled faintly of mold, and the locked-off areas, sections under construction, felt like they were hiding secrets no one wanted to uncover. Boys were assigned the ground floor and gymnasium, while the girls were upstairs. Most of us grouped together in the nursery. It felt safer there, with its pastel walls and soft carpet littered with abandoned toys. Even with the locked rooms nearby, it was better than the long, dark hallways leading to nowhere. Night settled in uneasily. I could feel it in the air, like a pressure building behind my ears. It started in the gym. One of the boys, Evan I think, was restless. While most of them had passed out on the floor or in their sleeping bags, he couldn't sleep. The gym was cavernous, its lights turned off except for the faint glow of a single exit sign. Above the gym, there were narrow windows that led to the sealed-off rooms upstairs. Evan swore later that he saw them first. The lights, flickering, faint, as if someone were pacing with a flashlight on the other side of the glass. At first, he thought it was one of the girls upstairs, until he saw the silhouettes. 2 figures standing still, just watching. Evan bolted out of the gym, white-faced, and refused to go back in. "Someone's up there," he said. The other guys laughed it off. They said he was paranoid, sleep-deprived. Maybe he was, but that didn't explain what happened next. Meanwhile, upstairs, the nursery had become our refuge. We'd piled into the room, 6 of us, pulling out board games to pass the time. Someone had brought apples to apples, and we were halfway through a round when I heard it, a faint scratching at the nursery door. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Probably the boys messing with us," Sarah said, rolling her eyes. But then it came again. Louder this time. A scratch, followed by a dull thud. The nursery door was one of those solid wooden ones with a frosted one-way mirror panel set into it. From inside the nursery, the glass reflected the room back at us, like a mirror. Outside, it was meant to let parents observe the room without being seen. I glanced up at the mirror. My breath caught in my throat. 2 faces stared back at us. Not our reflections, 2 faces on the other side of the glass, grinning ear to ear. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. They weren't supposed to be there. No one was supposed to be there. "Did you?" I began, but before I could finish, one of the girls screamed, "I saw it! I saw them! Everyone was looking at the glass now, and the room exploded into chaos. The faces vanished, but the banging on the door grew louder, more frantic. "Who's out there?" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. I didn't think so. I just moved. I bolted toward the door, yanking it open. The hallway outside was empty, silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I stepped into the hall, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Footsteps, heavy running footsteps, echoed down the corridor. I spun toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just the long, empty hallway leading to the locked-off sections of the church. Then the air shifted. It's hard to describe, but it felt like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I felt watched. The others huddled behind me, peering nervously into the hall. "See anyone?" Sarah whispered. I shook my head. "No one's here." But we all knew that wasn't true. The hallway stretched ahead, its shadows too dark, too still. At the far end, the locked double doors leading to the construction zone seemed impossibly far away. And then we heard it. Laughter, soft, faint, but unmistakable. It came from the locked section of the church, a high-pitched giggle that sent a chill down my spine. It didn't sound like any of the boys. It didn't sound like anyone. By the time the pastor arrived, we were all in a panic. He stormed upstairs, furious, accusing us of playing pranks and scaring each other. "No one else is here," he said, his voice firm. "You're imagining things." But we weren't. We told him about the faces, the banging, the laughter. He dismissed it all, telling us we were overtired and letting our imaginations run wild. "I locked those doors myself," he said. "No one's been in those rooms for months." His words didn't comfort us. They didn't explain the sounds or the faces. None of us slept that night. Story 3. It was a quiet winter night, the kind where the world feels eerily still under a blanket of darkness. I remember the cold biting at my cheeks as I sat in the passenger seat of my dad's truck. He had been a janitor for our old church for years, a job that seemed simple enough, but had its moments of unease. That night, for reasons I can't explain, I felt a heaviness in my chest. Something felt off. I didn't say anything to him, though. We were just there to clean, like always. The church was enormous, built decades ago atop a hill that overlooked the town. Its towering steeples reached into the sky, and the stained glass windows, even in the dark, seemed to watch you as you approached. Dad unlocked the side door, punched in the code to deactivate the alarm, and we stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, and colder than it should have been. The silence in there always unnerved me. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, like the building itself was listening. We got straight to work, starting with the downstairs bathrooms. My dad moved quickly, his routine practiced and efficient, while I trailed behind, scrubbing sinks and mopping floors. The sound of our footsteps echoed down the long, empty hallways, and every so often I thought I heard something. Faint shuffling, a creak. But when I stopped to listen, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just the old building settling. About an hour in, we were almost done. We'd saved the gym for last since it was the biggest and most time-consuming to clean. I was finishing up in the last bathroom when it happened. Bang! The gym doors slammed open. Not just a creak or a small push. They flew open so violently it made the wall shake. I froze, the mop slipping from my hands. My heart felt like it stopped beating for a second. Dad was just down the hall, and I heard him curse under his breath before rushing toward me. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. He was trying to sound brave, but I could see the unease in his eyes. "No way," I whispered back. "I'm not staying here alone." He didn't argue. Together, we crept down the hallway toward the gym. My hands were clammy and my stomach churned. As we approached, the door was still swinging slightly, the metal handle clicking against the frame. Dad pushed it open the rest of the way and we stepped inside. The gym was massive, the kind that seemed to stretch forever in the dark. The only light came from the dim emergency exit signs, casting an eerie red glow over the space. The air was heavier here, colder too. We scanned the room, our eyes darting to every shadow. There was nothing. I never went back to that church. Some things are better left unexplored. Story 5. It was the summer I turned 12, and my aunt was getting married in a small, creaky church in my mom's hometown. My aunt had waited until her mid-40s to tie the knot, so the ceremony was low-key, just close family, a few friends, and cake and punch in the fellowship hall afterward. The church wasn't grand, just an old wooden building perched on the edge of town, surrounded by sagging gravestones and leaning trees that whispered in the breeze. I'd been there a handful of times as a kid during family visits, so I knew my way around, but it always gave me an uneasy feeling. The wedding went smoothly, my aunt looked happy, and everyone was in high spirits. But once the bride and groom drove off to their honeymoon, the cleanup began. My mom was organizing everyone like a drill sergeant, packing up leftovers and folding tables. It was nearly dark when someone noticed my little sister and cousin were missing. "Where's Lily?" my mom asked, frowning as she scanned the room. "And Danny?" my aunt chimed in, suddenly concerned. Mom turned to me. "Go find them. They're probably playing hide and seek somewhere. Don't take forever. We're ready to leave." I sighed but didn't argue. Searching for them seemed easy enough. I started downstairs, checking under tables, behind the piano, even outside near the parking lot. Nothing. That's when it hit me. They must have gone upstairs. The second floor of the church housed the nursery and Sunday school rooms, a haven of toys and books for bored kids. The stairs creaked as I climbed, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. It was dark upstairs, darker than I expected. I fumbled along the wall, searching for a light switch, but my hand found nothing but peeling paint. The dim glow from the parking lot outside barely filtered through the dusty windows, casting eerie shadows along the hallway. "Lily? Danny?" My voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the silence. I peeked into the nursery first. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing rows of tiny chairs and shelves of forgotten toys. Everything was still. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. "Come on, you guys," I called again, louder this time. No response. A shiver ran down my spine as I stepped back into the hallway. My gut told me they weren't up here, but I decided to check the other rooms just in case. Nothing. Each room was as empty and lifeless as the last. I was about to head back downstairs when I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak behind me. I froze. "Lily!" I whispered, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening. I slowly turned around, my pulse hammering in my ears. At first I saw nothing, just the long, dark hallway stretching back toward the stairs. But then, out of the corner of my eye, something moved. It emerged from the shadows near the far end of the hall, its shape massive and menacing. A dog. No, not a dog, something worse. Its black fur seemed to swallow the weak light, and its eyes burned a deep, unnatural red. They weren't eyes meant for seeing. They felt like they were meant for something much darker, much crueler. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The thing started toward me, its footsteps eerily silent despite its size. Its head was low, ears pinned back like it was stalking prey. My legs finally obeyed me, and I stumbled backward, my hands searching blindly for the banister of the staircase. As I stepped onto the first stair, I heard a low growl, guttural and raw, reverberating through the hallway. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a vibration that seemed to crawl under my skin and root itself deep in my chest. I didn't think. I didn't even feel my body move. I just ran. I tripped down the stairs, twisting my ankle on the last step. Pain shot through me, but I didn't care. I had to get out. Hobbling toward the front doors, I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was still there, standing at the top of the stairs, its red eyes locked on me. It didn't move, but it didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze me. I burst through the doors and into the cool night air, gasping like I'd just surfaced from deep water. My family was gathered near the car, chatting like nothing had happened. "There you are," my mom snapped. "What took you so long? And what happened to your ankle?" I tried to speak, but no words came out. My heart was pounding too hard. "Where's Lily and Danny?" my aunt asked. "They're with you," I finally managed to choke out. Everyone stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "They've been here the whole time," my mom said, pointing toward the car. Sure enough, there they were, sitting in the back seat, laughing and playing with a couple of toys. I wanted to tell her, to tell all of them, But how could I explain what I'd seen? I could barely understand it myself. I just shook my head, muttering something about being mistaken. We drove off soon after, the church shrinking in the rearview mirror. No one ever mentioned the upstairs again. I never went back to that church, not for any reason. Story 6. The Visitor in the Shadows. Saturday night mass was usually routine for me. I had been an altar server for years, so the flow of the service was second nature. My younger sister Clara and I were wearing our white albs, ordinary time cinctures snug around our waists, moving in rhythm with the hymns. It was a peaceful, quiet evening in our small-town church, the kind of evening where nothing should have gone wrong. That night we had a visiting priest, Father Dominic. Young, maybe in his late 20s, he had this calm confidence about him that put people at ease. He joked a little with us before the service, but nothing out of the ordinary. I noticed some of the congregation stealing glances at him. His youth and looks were hard to miss. For me, though, it was just another mass. Or so I thought. The homily began, and Father Dominic spoke with passion, his voice echoing softly off the vaulted ceiling. I stood near the altar, trying to stay still, my hands clasped in front of me. Clara was next to me, focused as always. Then I saw it. From where I stood, I had a clear view of the side entrance, a set of heavy glass doors framed by red brick. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A faint, flickering motion caught my eye, just at the edge of the door where the brick cornered into shadow. I squinted, trying not to be obvious, but my heart started to pound when I realized something was climbing. It wasn't big, about the size of my hand, maybe smaller, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, and deliberate. It was black, with a round, fuzzy head that caught the dim light just enough to glint like slick oil. Its body flattened and expanded as it climbed, sticking to the wall like it belonged there. My breath hitched, and I felt heat rise in my chest. I told myself it was probably just a big moth or a bird. But as I focused in, dread crept up my spine. This wasn't a moth. It had small, leathery, wing-like arms that twitched and pulled its body upward. Its head tilted as if sniffing the air. And then it moved in a flash, up the brick and closer to the glass. A bat. I froze, barely hearing Father Dominic's voice anymore. A bat had found its way into the church. My first thought was ridiculous. At least it's on the other side of the glass. But that did nothing to stop the prickling fear crawling across my skin. Bats were harmless, right? That's what people always said. But I'd never been this close to one before, and this thing didn't look harmless. Its movements were too intentional, its head jerking like it was searching for something. And why was it awake? Bats didn't come out until nightfall, and it was still early evening, barely dusk. I stared at it, willing it to stay put, but it moved again, this time faster. It scuttled up to the top corner of the glass door and stopped, its head cocked in my direction. I swear it was looking at me. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to stay calm. The last thing I wanted was to freak out in front of everyone. Clara noticed my tension and nudged me gently. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded stiffly, not trusting myself to speak. How could I explain it? There's a bat at the door, and I think it's watching me. The homily droned on, but I couldn't hear it. All I could focus on was the glass door and the shadow clinging to it. And then it happened. The bat moved again, this time with a sudden, violent burst of energy. It darted downward, hitting the glass with a faint thunk that only I seemed to hear. My breath hitched as I watched it press against the glass, wings spreading slightly. It wasn't huge, but the sight of those membranous wings was enough to send my heart racing. And then, to my absolute horror, it slipped through the crack. The doors weren't perfectly sealed. There was just enough of a gap between the glass and the frame for it to squeeze through. It moved with an almost liquid ease, wings flattening against its body, head pushing forward like it knew exactly how to get inside. It was in. I grabbed Clara's arm, squeezing hard enough to make her gasp. "What?" she hissed, her eyes darting to my face. I couldn't answer. My eyes were locked on the bat as it clung to the inside of the door, just above the handle. It shifted, wings twitching, and then it launched itself into the air. The church was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of candles and the overhead lights illuminating the altar. The bat's shadow flickered against the walls as it flew, its erratic movements impossible to predict. People noticed immediately. A woman in the second pew let out a startled gasp, and then someone else whispered loudly, "What is that?" Father Dominic paused mid-sentence, his eyes lifting to follow the commotion. The congregation's murmurs grew louder as the bat swooped low, circling above the pews. I felt panic rising in my chest, my body frozen in place. Clara clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's a bat!" someone finally shouted. The church erupted into chaos. People ducked, covering their heads, some scrambling to move away from the aisles. The bat darted erratically, its wings slicing through the air with a faint whispering sound. Father Dominic tried to calm everyone down, raising his hands and calling for order, but his voice was lost in the rising tide of panic, and then the bat flew toward the altar. I didn't think, I just reacted. Grabbing Clara, I pulled her down behind the altar table, our white albs brushing the cold marble floor. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The bat swooped low over the altar, its shadow stretching across the crucifix behind it. For one horrifying moment, it landed on the cross, its small body clinging to the wooden beam like it belonged there. The church fell silent. The bat hung there, its head turning slowly, those beady black eyes scanning the room. It was watching us. I don't know how I knew, but I felt it. Its gaze lingered on me, and in that moment, it wasn't just a bat. It felt like something else, something far older and darker than I could comprehend. Then just as suddenly as it had appeared, it launched itself into the air again, flying straight back to the side entrance. It slipped out the same way it had come in, disappearing into the night without a sound. The silence in the church was deafening. No one moved for what felt like an eternity. Father Dominic cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly. "Let us pray." The rest of the Mass continued, but the atmosphere was heavy, charged with unease. I don't think anyone really listened. Claire and I stayed close to the altar, too shaken to even look at each other. Later that night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bat on the cross, its head turning, those black eyes boring into me. I haven't served at Mass since. Story 7. I grew up in a small town nestled deep in the hills, where the church stood at the center of everything. For 12 years, I was an altar server at St. Catherine's Catholic Church, a role I took seriously, even after the faith started to lose its grip on me. I spent countless hours preparing for Mass, lighting candles, and assisting Father Michael. The scent of incense still lingers in my mind, along with the memory of hymns echoing through the pews. But things changed when I was in my late 20s. My faith dwindled, and curiosity led me down another path. I turned to Wicca, drawn by its connection to nature and its promise of freedom. It wasn't rebellion. It felt like I was finally finding myself. I hadn't been back to St. Catherine's in years when a surge of nostalgia, or maybe guilt, made me step through its heavy oak doors again. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon. The church was empty, save for the faint glow of votive candles and the silence that seemed alive, pressing against the skin. I told myself I just wanted to sit, to reflect. But part of me knew I wanted something else. Closure, maybe, or absolution for turning my back on what I'd been raised to believe. Father Michael spotted me from the back of the church, his kind eyes lighting up with recognition. He wasn't surprised to see me, though I hadn't called ahead. We spoke briefly, his words warm and welcoming. "The church is always here for you," he said, smiling as if I'd never left. Then he excused himself, mentioning something about preparing the tabernacle before evening prayers. That was when I felt it, a pull. I don't know how else to describe it. My eyes drifted toward the holy room, the small chamber behind the altar where the Eucharist is kept. Its proper name, the sanctuary of the tabernacle, escaped me in the moment, but I knew what it was. It's where the consecrated host, the body of Christ, is locked away in the gilded tabernacle, guarded like the sacred treasure it is. The door to the holy room was slightly ajar. I hesitated, then stepped forward, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just curiosity, a pull from my old life. I pushed the door open and slipped inside. The room was dimly lit, its single red candle flickering weakly. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and the silence was deeper here, as if the walls absorbed every sound. There it was, the tabernacle, a gleaming golden box on a pedestal, its ornate surface reflecting the faint light. Its door was locked, as it always was. I'd never seen it open in all my years as an altar server. Only Father Michael and the deacons had keys. I shouldn't have been there, but I couldn't leave. I stood frozen, staring at the tabernacle, when I heard it, a soft click. It was so faint I almost didn't notice it, but my eyes darted to the source of the sound. The tabernacle's lock had turned. My breath hitched. I hadn't touched it. No one was there. Then slowly, the door of the tabernacle creaked open. My blood ran cold. I took an involuntary step back, my legs trembling. Inside the tabernacle, the golden ciborium that held the consecrated hosts seemed to glint in the dim light. It was as if the very air shifted, growing heavier and colder. The single candle in the room flickered violently, and then it went out. Darkness swallowed the room. I gasped, fumbling for the door, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. A chill swept over me, and with it came a sound, a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. My ears rang, my chest tightened, and my knees buckled. I fell to the cold stone floor, clutching at the rosary I'd long abandoned but still carried in my pocket. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a deep, guttural voice broke through the void. "You don't belong here," I screamed. I scrambled to my knees, pressing my forehead to the ground. Tears streamed down my face as I muttered prayers I hadn't said in years. "Our Father, who art in heaven." The door behind me burst open, flooding the room with light. I whipped around to see Father Michael standing there, his face pale and stricken. He crossed the threshold, his voice sharp. "What are you doing here?" I couldn't speak. I could only point to the tabernacle, its door still ajar. The extinguished candle sat in its holder, its wax dripping onto the altar. He moved past me, his movements deliberate but tense. He closed the tabernacle door and whispered something under his breath, a prayer or a plea, I couldn't tell. Finally, he turned to me. His face was drawn, his expression unreadable. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low. I told him everything, the unlocking, the whispers, the voice. I left nothing out, my words tumbling over themselves in panic. He listened in silence, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. When I finished, he didn't scold me or call me foolish. Instead, he said something I'll never forget. "Miracles aren't meant to be shared. They lose their power if they are." "Miracle?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "That wasn't a miracle." He didn't respond. Instead, he helped me to my feet and led me out of the holy room, closing the door firmly behind us. He made me promise not to speak of what happened to anyone, not even to him again. "Leave it behind," he said, "and don't come back unless your heart is certain." I never did go back to St. Catherine's. I couldn't. Whatever happened in that room wasn't something I could explain or rationalize. It wasn't something I could pray away. It stayed with me, creeping into the edges of my thoughts when I least expected it. Story 8. When I was 18, my parents took over a small church in a quiet, forgotten town. My dad was the pastor, and my mom poured her soul into making the place feel warm and welcoming. It didn't take long for us to hear the whispers. "That place has a history," the townsfolk would say, their voices dropping as if the church could somehow hear them. People had died there, they told us. Too many to count. But my dad was a man of faith, and he brushed it off. "The past doesn't define a place," he would say. "God does." I wanted to believe him. For the first year or so, I managed to. Sure, the old sanctuary, 90 years old and filled with shadows even in the daytime, gave me the creeps. But that's just how old buildings are, right? It's all in your head. At least that's what I told myself. But things started to happen. Small, strange things. Doors that were locked would swing open. Lights would flicker even though the wiring had been redone. My dad chalked it up to old construction. My mom wouldn't even talk about it. I tried to ignore it, but some part of me knew something wasn't right. The worst happened when my parents left for Maine. They made that trip every year to visit friends, but I'd grown tired of tagging along. "I'll stay home," I told them. "Watch the house, take care of things." They were hesitant at first, but they agreed. On the second day, I decided to walk over to the church. I wasn't planning to stay long, just wanted to grab some snacks from the mini fridge in the back of the old sanctuary. The church was empty, as it always was on weekdays. The sun poured through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the worn wooden floors. It should have felt peaceful, but as I stepped inside, I felt it immediately. The air was heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. I told myself it was nothing. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The mini fridge was tucked under the counter at the back of the sanctuary, behind the snack booth we used during events. I crouched down, opened the fridge, and started pulling out a couple of cans of soda. The quiet was overwhelming. No creaks, no distant hum of traffic, nothing. Just me and the silence. When I stood up and turned to leave, that's when I saw it. There, standing in the doorway to the sanctuary, was something. My breath caught in my throat. At first, my brain struggled to process what I was looking at. It wasn't a person, not really. It was tall, with a bald, pale head and a long, dark robe that seemed to billow slightly, even though there was no wind. Its face, or the absence of it, was the worst part. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin where a face should have been. For a moment, I was frozen. I couldn't move. My brain screamed at my body to do something, run, scream, anything. But I was rooted to the spot. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if it was waiting for me to do something. And then, in an instant, it was gone. Not like it walked away, not like it faded. 1 second it was there, and the next it wasn't. That broke the spell. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I sprinted down the aisle, through the double doors and out into the sunlight. I didn't stop running until I was back at the parsonage, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. I didn't go back to the church that day, or the next. When my parents came home a few days later, I didn't tell them what happened. My dad would have tried to explain it away, and my mom, well, I wasn't sure how she'd react, but I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. Over the next few months, I tried to forget about it. I tried to convince myself it didn't happen, that it was some trick of the light or my mind playing games. But every time I stepped into that old sanctuary, I felt it. I never saw the figure again, but I always felt like I wasn't alone, like something was watching me, waiting. I moved out a year later, and my parents eventually left the church too. They never said why, but I got the sense they'd started to feel it too. The heaviness, the unease. I haven't been back since. Story 9. I worked as a janitor at a church for nearly 8 years. The church, an old building constructed in the early 1900s, was a place that had witnessed generations of prayers, weddings, and baptisms. It stood as a proud symbol of faith in the community, but beneath its stained glass windows and grand wooden pews, there was a dark undercurrent, something unsettling that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the age of the place, or the stories that had surrounded it over the years. But something about being there at night, when it was empty and silent, always felt wrong. I'm a Christian, so I've always believed in the spiritual world, angels, demons, that sort of thing. But working there, alone, I had to admit something deeper was going on. It wasn't just the architecture of the church, the creaking floors, or the hollow echoes of the empty rooms. No, it was something else, something far more sinister. The church had several buildings, some old and some newer additions. The old ones were always the worst, creepy, cold, and with a strange smell of dust and decay that never quite went away. It didn't help that certain areas of the building were known for their history. You could feel it if you were sensitive enough, a heaviness in the air, the feeling that you were being watched or followed. I'd go in there during the day when the place was bustling with activity, and I'd be fine. But the nights were different. The silence was suffocating, and the loneliness, well, it felt like it had a presence of its own. I worked late into the night most evenings, cleaning when the last of the parishioners had gone home. I'd lock up the church, check the doors, and make sure all the lights were off, except for one building. One building I could never bring myself to lock up until I had checked every single door inside. That building, let's call it the chapel annex, was the worst. It had a history of being used for exorcisms, a fact I knew because I'd overheard hushed conversations from the staff. Something had gone down in that room, things that never fully left. I'd heard about it from my coworkers, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of their words in the pit of my stomach. One night I was tasked with shampooing the chairs in that very room, the room that had seen the worst of it. My heart always raced when I entered. I turned on every light, unlocked every door on that floor, making sure that if anything were to happen, I would know it. I'd seen things out of the corner of my eye before, flickers of movement, shadows that didn't belong, but I chalked it up to fatigue. After all, it was easy to convince myself I was just tired, overworked. But that night, no amount of fatigue could explain what happened. I was shampooing a row of chairs, my back to the rest of the room. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it was pressing down on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation, the silence. But then, I heard it. A faint rattling sound, like metal being scraped against wood. My stomach churned. The hairs on my arms rose. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The stack of chairs that had been neatly arranged in front of me was moving. Not just shifting, but rattling violently, as if an invisible hand was shaking them. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was deafening. It wasn't just the noise. It was the force behind it. The chairs were moving on their own, rattling as if something or someone was trying to break free from their restraints. I stood there, unable to move, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. In the back of my mind, I knew I had to get out. I had to leave, but I couldn't tear myself away. The shaking grew louder. The chairs began to rattle so hard I was sure they'd fall over. My heart was pounding in my chest as the terror in my veins grew stronger. I took a step back, my eyes fixed on the chaos in front of me. And then, for a brief moment, everything stopped. Silence. Absolute silence. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. Something was stopping me. My legs felt like lead. My brain was screaming at me to move, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't explain. The moment stretched on. Time seemed to blur. And then it happened. A loud, bone-chilling slam echoed through the room. One of the chairs was thrown from the stack. It hit the floor with such force that it seemed to shake the very walls. I could barely breathe. My body finally reacted. I bolted out of the room, leaving the doors wide open behind me, the lights still blaring in the empty space. I didn't stop running until I reached the front of the building. My heart was still racing when I found one of my coworkers, a woman who had been cleaning the other end of the building. I was breathless, my words tumbling over each other as I told her what had happened. "I need you to come back with me," I said, nearly pleading. "What happened?" she asked, her voice skeptical at first. But when she saw the look on my face, the fear, she didn't hesitate. We both returned to the chapel annex, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I was terrified. When we entered, the room was eerily quiet. The chairs were back in their original positions, stacked neatly against the wall. Everything looked just as it had before, as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what had rattled those chairs, thrown that one to the floor. It wasn't just the old building creaking under its own weight. It wasn't just the wind. There was something in that room, something that didn't want to be seen. I didn't go back to that building alone after that. I couldn't. Every time I walked past it, I could feel the weight of something watching me from inside. To this day, I don't know what happened in that room, but I know this. There's something far darker going on than anyone could imagine. Story 10. I've always worked at the church in the small town just outside of Hamburg, the kind of place where people don't ask too many questions. I'm not a priest, not even a regular attendee. I'm the caretaker, the one who sweeps the floors and makes sure the candles are lit, that sort of thing. The church is old, about 750 years to be exact. The kind of place that reeks of history, where every stone and beam feels like it's seen something you and I never will. And every now and then, that feeling sneaks up on you. But last night was different. I was the last one there. The evening service had wrapped up a couple of hours before. The small crowd long gone. The night was cold and black, a bitter wind cutting through the open door as I closed it behind me. But I didn't bother turning on the lights. I've worked there long enough to know every creak and groan of the place. The low light of the candles near the altar, maybe 15 meters away, were enough for me. The orange glow flickered and wavered in the silence of the stone walls. I walked down the aisle alone, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the church. The air was thick with the scent of burning wax, a faint trace of incense hanging in the corners. It was peaceful, almost comforting. But that feeling, that sense of being watched, crept up on me before I even realized it. It wasn't like the usual unease I sometimes get, especially after hours. It was sharper, colder. It was as if something had pressed in on me from behind, like a shadow that wasn't my own. But I didn't stop. I kept walking, my shoes tapping against the stone floor, the candles only getting a little brighter as I got closer to them. Halfway down that feeling, it grew stronger, like someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. But when I spun around, there was nothing. I felt stupid for getting spooked. Maybe it was just the late hour, the fatigue setting in, but I kept going. The altar was just ahead, the flickering flames dancing in the dim light. I reached out to blow out the candles, and that's when it happened. A sudden chill ran through me, so cold it made my bones ache. The kind of cold you only feel in the dead of winter, but this wasn't the season for it. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel it now, something was there. Not just behind me, it was everywhere. I hurried, maybe too quickly, and blew out the first candle. But as I reached for the second, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, prickling with an icy dread. Then I heard it, a soft rustle, the faintest sound of fabric, like someone moving. I froze, holding my breath. The candle I'd just blown out flickered once, twice, then went out completely. But it wasn't the wind, I knew that. The air was still. There were no open windows. Nothing should have disturbed the flame. I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was nothing, but my legs felt like stone. My heart was hammering in my chest. I looked over my shoulder again, but the aisle was empty. No one there. I blew out the last candle, my hands shaking as I did, and that's when I heard it again. This time clearer. A voice, not loud, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. "Leave!" It was like the words were inside my head, not spoken out loud. They came from everywhere, as if the walls themselves had whispered them. My stomach lurched. I didn't know what to do. My feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look around, I couldn't turn. All I could do was stand there, my body frozen, caught between the overwhelming urge to run and the crushing weight of fear. The church had never felt this alive before. Alive with something I didn't understand, something I couldn't see. My pulse raced in my ears, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Leave," the voice repeated, a little louder this time. I didn't think. I just acted. My legs finally moved, and I bolted, running down the aisle toward the door. The sound of my footsteps was deafening now, like they were chasing me. And then, something else. The floor beneath me. Was it shifting? No, it couldn't have been. I was losing it. But as I reached the door, my hand fumbled for the lock. My fingers were trembling so hard I almost couldn't get it. Every time I thought I was safe, every time I thought I'd made it out, I felt it. Cold breath on the back of my neck. A presence so close I could almost feel its weight pressing against me. And then, just as my hand clicked the lock into place, I heard the last thing that made my heart stop. The door slammed, but there was no wind. There had been no gust, no breeze. The door had just slammed on its own. I didn't look back. I didn't even wait. I ran. I don't even remember how I got to my car. I just remember the feeling, that sense of being followed, of something watching, waiting. I'm not one to believe in ghosts or anything like that, but whatever I felt in that church that night, I can't explain. It wasn't the usual feeling of being alone in a dark, ancient place. It wasn't the usual dread I sometimes get when I'm working there too late. It was something else. Something alive. And it didn't want me there. And I won't be going back alone again. Not after what happened. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.